As you obviously know, Fidel Castro died on Friday at 10:29 in the evening, local time in Havana. And although this event was expected, Fidel Castro was very old and had had ill health for a number of years. He stepped down formally from his political positions in 2008. And he had been seen rarely. He had few public appearances recently at the Congress of the Communist Party and so on. But everyone knew that this was coming. But on Saturday I was talking to a comrade in Santiago, and he said, listen, we all knew that this was going to happen. It's inevitable, happens to everyone, and he had ill health, but it still came as a shock. And I don't know if you've seen some of the images today from Havana, where thousands of people are streaming in Revolution Square, paying the last respects to Fidel Castro, who played such an important role for many decades in Cuban political life, and particularly the Cuban Revolution. But this is the same all across the island. And I will say it's not just in Cuba, particularly in Latin America, across different countries in Latin America, thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of young people, veteran activists, left-wing activists, revolutionaries, they feel like they lost someone who played a very important role for many years. And we need to try to understand why this is. And also at the same time, as you've probably seen in your TV screens over here, there are also people celebrating Fidel's death. In the Spanish TV is a constant non-stop images of Miami, where counter-revolutionary exile Cubans are actually celebrating on the streets. They've been celebrating for 2 or 3 days. In Madrid at the weekend, there were almost fist fights between groups of supporters and opponents of the Cuban Revolution outside the embassy. So this is an event which has left no one unmoved or untouched. But obviously we need to try to understand why this is. Most of the commentary in the media and the main political leaders across the world have made statements about the death of Fidel Castro. Some have been more polite and diplomatic, let's say. Some have been more open and brazen in the happiness that Fidel is finally gone from their point of view. But I will say that there are reasons why certain people celebrate today and certain people mourn. When Hugo Chavez died a few years ago, not so long ago, Fidel Castro said, if you want to know who Hugo Chavez is, look at who's celebrating or look at who's mourning. And I think the same thing pretty much applies to Fidel Castro. The reason why the rulers in many countries of the world celebrate today the death of Fidel Castro is because Fidel Castro was for many years a representative of a revolution that stood up to US imperialism, that developed the living conditions of the masses to an extent that's not been seen in many other places around the world. And this is also the reason why workers, peasants, youth, left-wing youth across the world today mourn the death of Fidel Castro. He's passing away. And this can be demonstrated in figures. If you want to make an appraisal of the Cuban Revolution, we could be talking for a long time. There are positive aspects, there are negative aspects, but it can also be summarized in figures. If you look, for instance, at basic indexes of social development, you will see that today life expectancy at birth in Cuba is 79.39 years. It was 62 at the time of the revolution. So the revolution itself and progress over these decades has massively improved life expectancy. But just to give you an idea, life expectancy in the United States today, by the same criteria, is 78.9. Life expectancy is slightly less in the United States, the most powerful capitalist country on the globe, than in Cuba, which after all is a small island in the Caribbean with very, very few natural resources, which has been subjected for decades to a blockade, an embargo by the United States. So that is in itself quite significant. In fact, we shouldn't be, if we want to be fair, we shouldn't be comparing Cuba with the United States or Europe. We should be comparing Cuba with neighboring countries in Latin America. Very close to Cuba is the island which contains Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Do you know what is the life expectancy at birth in Haiti? Which is an island very similar to Cuba. It's also a Caribbean island, similar climate and so on. And life expectancy in Haiti is only 62 years of age. So there are 16 years of difference between living in a country that's ruled by capitalism and living in a very similar country where capitalism has been abolished. And this, I will say, summarizes the gains of the Cuban Revolution. You could give figures like this for many other social indicators. Infant mortality in Cuba is lower, the rate of infant mortality in Cuba is lower than in the United States. And it compares favorably also to Europe. This is about the same as in Europe. In Europe, it's slightly better. But it compares very favorably, not only with Haiti, which is after all the poorest country in the continent, but with other countries which have developed economies, like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, which are large countries with economic resources and so on, but where capitalism does exist. There's no other significant difference between these two types of countries, and it does show. If you want to make an appraisal of the figure of Fidel Castro, you really are making an appraisal of the revolutionary history of Cuba. You need to understand the context in which he was born, in which he grew up, in which he got involved in politics, and then in revolutionary politics. Fidel Castro was born in 1926 in a small village. It wasn't even a village. He was born in a landed state where there was a small settlement where the people who worked in the sugarcane were living. His father was a Galician from Galicia in Spain who had fought against Cuban independence in the War of Independence and then returned and settled in Cuba. And although he arrived in Cuba as a poor man with nothing to his name, he became quite wealthy. And at one point he had about 1,000 hectares of land, plus he was cultivating or renting another 10,000. So he became quite a wealthy person, Fidel's dad. And this was in Biran, in the province of Holguin, in the east of the country. The east of Cuba is also the part of the country that has the most deep-rooted revolutionary traditions. All revolutionary movements in Cuba have always started in that region around Santiago and so on. He was, as a very young child, he was sent to Santiago to study. I won't go into all the details of his life, but he studied after a few years in which he even suffered hunger. But he then was able to study in the best private religious schools in Cuba, run by the Jesuits and by La Salle. And first in Santiago, and then in Havana, where he did his last years before he went to university. In 1944, he entered university. 1945. In Cuba at that time was a country which had only just achieved its formal national independence in 1898 from Spain. Cuba was the last country in Latin America to achieve independence, or at least formal independence, because it had the misfortune of being the last country to achieve independence from a decaying imperialist power, Spain, at a time when there was already in the region another rising imperialist power, the United States, which is only 90 miles away from the shores of Cuba. And this meant that from the very beginning, Cuba became free from Spain and dominated by the United States. I don't know if you know, but the most graphical demonstration of this domination is the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment is an amendment that was put in the Cuban Constitution, forced in the Cuban Constitution by the government of the United States, which said that the United States had the right to intervene militarily in Cuba if United States interests were affected. I mean, how can you describe that as independence? Anyone who wanted to be the president of Cuba had to go first to the US embassy to seek permission. And the United States dominated the economic and political life of Cuba for the decades that went up until 1945, at the time that we were talking about, when Fidel Castro started his university studies, and he studied law. A few later on, he actually enrolled in 3 different degrees, but he became interested in 2 things. His first interest in politics came from 2 different sides. First of all, he considered himself an anti-imperialist of a Latin American character. He was not only interested in the situation of Cuba, but he immediately sympathized with the anti-imperialist cause of other Latin American peoples. For instance, he became involved in the struggle for the return of the Panama Canal to Panama. He was interested in the issue of the Malvinas, the Falkland Islands. He even participated in 1947 in a failed military incursion in the Dominican Republic, where they wanted to overthrow the dictatorship of Trujillo, a dictator had been imposed by the United States. And then in 1948 he traveled to Colombia to attend a meeting of students, a Latin American meeting of students, and he witnessed the events of El Bogotazo, which was the killing of a left-wing, a radical leader, Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, who was becoming very popular amongst the workers, the peasants, and the progressive layers in Colombia. He was assassinated on the 9th of April, and there was a massive uprising in which even sections of the police participated and so on. He was present, and he participated also in that movement. That kind of started to shape his politics, but above all, he was very interested in the history of Cuba and the history of Cuba's struggle for independence and national sovereignty. The struggle of José Martí and the revolutionary Cuban party. But later on, different ways, there had been in Cuba wave after wave of attempts to really free the country from foreign domination. Very heroic and revolutionary attempts. But Cuba was also peculiar in another way. Many other countries in Latin America fought for independence at the beginning of the 19th century, but Cuba was actually fighting for independence at the beginning of the 20th century, and the socio-economic structure of the country was different, i.e. there was a very strong working class in Cuba, which had not existed, say, in 1810, 1812 in Venezuela, for instance. There were hundreds of thousands of workers who were working in the sugarcane crop, but there were only seasonal workers for 2 or 3, maybe 4 months a year. They would work in this crop, and for the rest of the year they were unemployed. Living social conditions were terrible in Cuba. Many people had no homes. Many people had no degree of literacy at all. And Cuba was de facto the brothel and the casino of the United States. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Godfather. There is a scene where all the different mafia families from the United States meet in Cuba, and they have a cake in the shape of the island profile, and they cut this cake amongst the different families, as they actually cutting the interests in the island. And this is not just a film; it's actually the reality of Cuba in the 1930s and 1940s. This very strong workers' movement had originally an anarcho-syndicalist tradition at the turn of the century, the beginning of the 20th century, and then in early 1920s they formed the Communist Party of Cuba, which was set up by different people, including some who had fought with Martí in the struggle for independence. It's also interesting to note that Martí based his revolutionary party amongst the workers, mainly the tobacco workers in Tampa, in Florida, but also in Cuba. And Carlos Balliño, who had been a part of the revolutionary Cuban party with Martí, went on to form the Communist Party in 1924, together with Julio Antonio Mella, a young student leader, whose story is not very well known. He died very young in 1929. He was assassinated by order of the Machado, the dictator of Cuba. And they established the Communist Party, which went on to have a big influence in the workers' movement. But then in the late 1920s and early 1930s, there was also very strong left opposition. The followers of Leon Trotsky were very powerful in the island, and they had a very strong influence in the workers' movement, particularly in Guantanamo and in Santiago, in the eastern provinces, where they control the local workers' federations, Federación Obrera de Guantánamo, Federación Obrera de Santiago. In 1933, not commonly known, there was a revolutionary general strike in Cuba against the dictatorship, and there were Soviets. In fact, in the sugar cane plantations, the Soviets lasted for months. The workers had taken over the haciendas, the landed states, and they had control of the situation for many months. This general strike was derailed, but also gave rise to a very short-lived left-wing government in 1933-34, the government of the 100 Days of Grau San Martí. And in this government of Grau San Martí, there was another very important revolutionary figure, Antonio Guiteras, who was the leader of an organization called the Student Left Wing, the Ala de Izquierda Estudiantil, and then went on to form another organization called La Joven Cuba, the Young Cuba. And he also mixed the ideas, or the struggle. His revolutionary strategy was to fight for national liberation and also social liberation. He considered himself a socialist, and he understood that the two tasks went together. Same ideas as Julio Antonio Mella. And this was the situation in the 1930s, and there was a military coup, the first military coup of Fulgencio Batista, whom we will find later on. By 1945, as Fidel was starting to get involved in politics, there was a whole generation of people in the university, young university students. And you have to understand that most university students at that time in Cuba came from middle class and upper class families. Working class families couldn't send the kids to university, they couldn't afford it. But nevertheless, they were becoming very radical. They were becoming close to the workers' movement as well, but they were not attracted by the Communist Party because the Communist Party had followed the Stalinist policy of popular frontism, and then later on the Stalinist policy of democracy against fascism in the Second World War. And this in Cuba in particular meant that the Communist Party was part of the 1940 Batista government. Batista was in power from 1940 to 1944, and the Communist Party was part of this government. Why? Because Batista was on the side of democracy, i.e. US imperialism, in the Second World War, and therefore the Communist Party was instructed by Stalin to join that government. All the democratic forces had to join together in that government, despite the fact that Batista had been a dictator, had been responsible for repression of workers, students, and was hated in Cuba. For this reason, reason, many young people, actually the Communist Party had 2 ministers in the Batista government in 1940, Juan Marinello and Carlos Rodriguez. And so for this reason, many young revolutionaries did not immediately become attracted to the Communist Party, but on the contrary, they were repelled. They might be interested in socialist ideas and so on, but they didn't join the Communist Party. And they joined all sorts of other movements. Fidel Castro started his political life as part of the youth of the Ortodoxo party formed by a senator called Chivas. And Chivas was one person who was denouncing the corruption of the government, and he wanted clean politics, return to Republican values, and so on. So his program wasn't particularly radical, he just wanted to clean up politics. And Fidel Castro was part of the youth of this movement. Chivas killed himself, he committed suicide in early 1950s, and the party became disorganized. By 1953, Batista was about to lose the elections, and he organized a coup. So in 1952, anyway, either in 1952 or 1953, Batista organized, in 1952, Fulgencio Batista carried out his second coup. And this triggered this group of revolutionary youth. There were many of them, but the one that Fidel was organized in decided that they had to do something, that they had to take action that will trigger a mass movement and bring down this dictatorship. And so they did. They organized a group of a few hundred young men and women. They got arms in different ways, and they decided to attack the Moncada barracks of the army in Santiago. And their idea was not necessarily that they were going to immediately bring down the government by themselves, but rather that they were going to spark a mass movement, a revolutionary insurrectional strike, by making an appeal, by making a bold stance, and then making an appeal to the masses. Now that failed. This was in July 26, 1953. The attempt failed. Half of the people involved were captured, about 55. All of those captures were tortured and killed with very brutal methods. Castro managed to escape, and he was finally arrested, and he was put on trial. And he used this trial to defend himself. He was a lawyer, and he used his trial to defend himself, and he made speech from the dock, which was then became known as "The History Will Absolve Me," in which he explained the reasons why they had carried out that action. And it was very effective way of using the public tribune to explain your ideas, and they couldn't prevent him from doing so. And so he explained what was the program of the M26 of July movement, M26-7 movement that he became the leader of. And the program, if you look at it, is not particularly radical or let's say it's not a communist or anti-capitalist program. They had 4 or 5 basic demands. 1, the restoration of the 1940 constitution. 2, agrarian reform. 3, the participation of industrial workers in company profits, having a share of company profits. The participation of sugarcane colonos, i.e. small peasant and rural laborers, in the profits of the sugarcane crop. And also the confiscation of the holdings of those who had been involved in corruption in previous governments. It's just basically they wanted the rule of law, Republican law, to be reinstated in Cuba. It's not particularly, it doesn't seem particularly radical, and it's certainly not a communist or socialist program by any stretch of imagination. Finally, Castro was released, was amnestied by Batista, and he fled into exile in Mexico with the idea of organizing an expedition, a group of men to go back, disembark in Cuba, and again try to spark a revolutionary movement against the dictatorship. This was, if you think about it, a bit of a crazy idea. They had a boat, the Granma, which held about 50 people, but they crammed 82 people on this boat. Many of them had never been at sea before. They got seasick, and they managed to finally cross over to Havana, to Cuba, and in the last days of 1956, the anniversary is this Saturday, I think, on the 3rd of December, they finally disembarked in the province around Santiago. The disembarkment was late, 2 or 3 days later than expected. Therefore, the actions that were supposed to take place in Santiago in conjunction with the disembarkment didn't take place on time. They were all ambushed, and many of them were captured. Out of the 82 people who participated in that disembarkment, only 12 remained free. The rest were either captured or killed by the forces of the Batista regime. And these 12 people embarked on a guerrilla war. They went into the mountains of Sierra Maestra, and in just over 2 years later, Batista had been forced to flee the country, and the revolution had triumphed. This might seem completely unexpected, and in fact, you could say that they were a bit daring or even mad, if you want. But they had an ideal, and they wanted to do something in order to implement it. And why is it that they in such a short space of time, they managed to defeat the Batista army, which had the backing of the United States and the capitalist class and the landowners and the imperialist companies and so on? The reason is that the regime was so rotten and so hated that the action of a small group of people triggered a chain reaction. It was not just the guerrilla war in the mountains, which involved no more than 500 people throughout the whole process, and perhaps up to 2,000 right at the end in the last few weeks. But it was also a movement in the underground, in the cities. Middle-class people, lawyers, university professors, journalists and so on, who hated the regime, started to organize in different organizations, Acción y Sabotaje and other organizations in the cities. And there was also a very strong workers' movement. This is not generally known, but in 1957 there was a revolutionary general strike under the dictatorship in Santiago, when the police killed Frank País, one of the main leaders of the underground in the cities. In 1958, there was another revolutionary general strike in April. There was a Congress of Workers in the Sierra Maestra that organized the workers to fight against the dictatorship. And finally, on the first day of 1959, January 1st, 1959, Batista was forced to flee the country, and he attempted to leave behind another government, someone from the regime, but wasn't as tainted as him, in order to give some continuity to the same regime. Fidel Castro and the guerrillas were far away from Havana when Batista fled, and they decided to declare a revolutionary general strike in Havana in order to prevent the formation of another regime, another continuity regime. And the revolutionary general strike lasted for 8 days. The workers came out, the population came out, and they took over the police stations. They controlled the situation in the capital until the guerrillas, in this case led by Camilo Cienfuegos and Che Guevara, who were closer in Santa Clara, arrived in the capital a few days later on the 8th of January. Fidel was in Santiago in the meantime, leading a different guerrilla column, and didn't arrive in the capital until a few days later. So you can see that it wasn't just a small band of guerrillas, but the revolutionary policies that they followed, everywhere they went, they gave the land to the peasants, so they started implementing the program of agrarian reform, and this completely destroyed the basis of the Batista army, which was a conscript army made up of the sons of agricultural workers and workers in the cities and poor people who, when they saw they were fighting against people who were giving them the land, they fled, they deserted, and the whole army collapsed eventually. Now, as I said, and I'll have to skip a few things here because this is going a bit slow, but they came to power in 1959 January, and they had carried out the revolution. Their intention was not to abolish capitalism. They were not socialists. Some amongst the guerrillas had already socialist ideas at that time, particularly Che Guevara, for instance, and Raúl Castro, who had been a member of the socialist youth, the youth of the Communist Party. But the general politics of the M26-7 was not socialist at all. In fact, it included quite a lot of bourgeois elements who were anti-communist. This was at the beginning of the Cold War, after all, if you remember. The first president of Cuba was, they had two presidents, Dorticós and Urrutia, and they were bourgeois people, respectable people. They put there in order to appease the bourgeoisie and appease the United States. They didn't want a confrontation. But what happened was that as soon as they started to implement agrarian reform in a serious way, in a law that was drafted by Che Guevara, then obviously the interests of the big capitalists and the landowners started to be touched, and they immediately organized a counter-reaction to this. There was a constant coup and counter-coup in which, for instance, the United States, the Cuban revolutionary government expropriated some landed states that belonged to US-owned companies that controlled the sugar cane crop. And then the United States say, okay, we're not going to purchase the sugar cane crop from Cuba anymore, which was the main customer of the Cuban sugar. And so then the Soviet Union stepped in and said, okay, we're going to buy it. And then the United States say, okay, if you touch any more companies, we're gonna instruct the oil refineries, which were all in the hands of the United States companies, Shell and other companies. Then they said, we're going to instruct them not to refine oil. And then the Soviet Union said, okay, we're going to send you oil. And the government said, okay, we're going to intervene, not nationalize at the beginning, but intervene these companies. The government had promised, for instance, to decrease the price of electricity and telephone tariffs. But these were two US-owned monopolies, the American Telecom and Telephone Company and another company that controlled the electricity. And so as soon as they started intervening, they had to, they clashed with US interest. And in a very short space of time, by nationalizing all those companies that were sabotaging the economy, and by implementing thorough agrarian reform, they realized that they had basically abolished capitalism without necessarily wanting to do so, just as in the form of defensive measures. It was a very, very short space of time in which all this happened. In April 1961, you probably know there was the attempted invasion of Bay of Pigs invasion. The Playa Girón, and they basically was a US-funded and organized invasion of the island carried out by counter-revolutionary elements from Cuba. These people were the actual owners of companies, factories, landed states and so on, that they went on a number of boats with the support of the United States and attempted to invade the island. On the eve of the invasion, Fidel Castro declared the socialist character of the revolution. Capitalism had been abolished, and on this basis they were able to achieve all these gains of the revolution. This is, I would say, maybe the most important point that we need to understand, that it was only on the basis of the abolition of capitalism that there could be any progress in Cuba. And the national independence, the development of their own economy, could only be carried out by expropriating multinational foreign companies, which were all US owned. And once they were expropriated, there was no capitalism anymore. Now, I won't have time to explain everything I wanted to, but I will just say a few things. First of all, the revolution took place in a very small island, as I said, 90 miles from the United States. And the United States immediately, in 1962, imposed an embargo and a blockade of the economy. So in stepped the Soviet Union. This was time of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had not wanted the revolution in Cuba, had not advised the Cuban revolutionaries to carry out the expropriation of capitalism. On the contrary, they were against. In fact, the Cuban Communist Party was all the time advising moderation, caution, do not provoke imperialism, and so on. But once the revolution was in motion, they supported it. So this, for a period of 30 years, was, on the one hand, a very positive economic relationship, because the Soviet Union purchased Cuban sugar at prices which were above the prices of the world market, and sold other products, industrial products, machinery, and consumer goods, to Cuba at prices that were below the world market, i.e. precisely the opposite of an imperialist relationship. But at the same time, there was a negative side to this, because in 1950s, 60s, in the Soviet Union, there wasn't a socialist democracy or workers' democracy by any stretch of imagination. There had been a Stalinist counter-revolution, and this also wrapped off into the Cuban revolution, particularly after the first phase. In the first phase, the Cuban leadership attempted to trace their own course. They wanted to spread the revolution to other countries. We can talk about this later if you want in the discussion. But by early 1970, they had been defeated. Che Guevara had been killed in Bolivia in 1967. All the attempts to trigger revolutions in other countries had failed for one reason or another that we don't have time to enter, and the revolution had become isolated and much more dependent from the Soviet Union. 1971-76 was the 5 gray years. There was repression of anyone who had different ideas in the fields of the arts, the economy, social sciences. There was, as you probably heard, there was repression there was homophobia was institutionalized. Homophobia obviously existed before the revolution, but by 1970-71 it became institutionalized in the new setup, and this was very negative development for the Cuban revolution, because it stifled debate, participation, and so on. That doesn't mean that the Cuban government stayed in power through repression. That's silly. No government can stay in power for 30 years only through repression. On the contrary, the government in Cuba had mass popular support because it had carried out the revolution, A, and B, because this revolution had given people concrete material gains that we just described. Education, healthcare, housing, many things that you couldn't find in any other Latin American country, you could find in revolution. And also something which is not material, but is a very important factor, which is a deep feeling of national sovereignty, of independence, of standing up to the strongest imperialist power, which was just 90 miles away from the shores of Cuba. And this is what allowed not only the resistance of the Cuban Revolution, but particularly the resistance of the Cuban Revolution after the fall of the Soviet Union in 89-91. They were left with nothing. All the trade had been disrupted, and it was a very, very, very difficult period, which is known as the special period. And they survived through that. But just to finish, today there are dangers that affect the Cuban revolution. I will say there's two main ones, and this we need to take into account in order to make a balance. The first one is that there are sections quite clearly in the leadership of the Cuban revolution who are toying with the idea of what is known as the Chinese way or the Vietnamese way, i.e. market reforms that eventually, allegedly, will give rise to economic growth. This is driven by desperation, a very desperate situation of a blockaded small island with very few natural resources. But I think this is dangerous because in China, if you look at it, what you have now is capitalism, and the restoration of capitalism in China has meant, yes, there's economic growth, very impressive economic growth, there's massive inequality, the destruction of the conquests of the revolution, like public health care, the pension system, the education, and everything. This same thing will happen in Cuba, which will be a massive disaster, and at the same time, there's massive overexploitation of the working class. This is the basis for the Chinese economic miracle. And the second danger, I will say, that exists in Cuba is the new tactics that Obama has started to implement. Obama has changed his tactics. As you can see, diplomatic relations have started to be reestablished, and they basically realized that the previous tactics have failed. They have failed to destroy the revolution by direct confrontation. And when I'm talking about direct confrontation, I'm not talking about small fish. I'm talking about 600 different plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, terrorist attacks, invasion, propaganda, the funding of counter-revolutionary groups inside Cuba, and a constant part and on top of the economic blockade and embargo, which is completely destroying for the economy. And they have decided to use different tactics to achieve the same aims, which is the restoration of capitalism and the destruction of the revolution in Cuba. And the different tactics is the tactics of opening up relations, opening up trade, and opening up the penetration of the world market into this very small and weak economy. Right now, the first measure that Obama took was to liberalize the amount of dollars that families can send back to their relatives in Cuba, the remittances. So instead of $100, it's now up to $400, and they want to increase it even more. Now, the problem is that because of the very low productivity of labor in Cuba, $400 is a lot of money in Cuba, and it's already started private accumulation of capital. And as private accumulation of capital develops, there will be a section of the population in Cuba that will have their own interest, their own material interest to restore capitalism. People who before, when everyone had one house, and these houses are now in a state of disrepair because of the economic situation and so on, but now there will be people who will have 5, 10, 20 houses, become big landlords, while other people will have no homes and they will go homeless, which is something that had not existed up until now in Cuba. And this is also very dangerous. What is the solution to this? In my opinion, just to finish, because the chairperson here is kicking me under the table, just to finish, to say that in my opinion, there's only two things that can save and defend the Cuban revolution, which in my opinion must be done. The conquest of the revolution are very precious and must be defended. And the capitalists and imperialists are now frothing in the mouth that now that Fidel is dead, even though he wasn't playing such a big role because of his illness more recently, but now that he's dead, this process will accelerate of capitalist restoration. You can see it in the declarations. The only way to revert this is, one, by introducing genuine workers' democracy, i.e. the participation of the workers and the population in general in the running of politics and the economy in Cuba, which now doesn't exist. And two, the spreading of the revolution to other countries. Revolution cannot be isolated in one country. It cannot. I mean, capitalist system is a worldwide capitalist system, and it affects everywhere in the world. Unless the revolution spread, the revolution will eventually collapse. And I will say that this is the best homage we can pay to the Cuban Revolution and the figure of Fidel that's been so closely associated with it. The struggle for socialism internationally and the participation in the debates that are taking place now amongst Cuban revolutionaries inside the Cuban Revolution about what is the way forward. Just to say this, while some who have no interest in human rights are now talking about human rights in Cuba, human rights in Cuba. The people who flew the national flag in Britain at half-mast when the Saudi king died, and who were selling arms to the Saudi regime, they're now talking about human rights in Cuba. They're not interested in human rights, don't worry about that. They're interested in their ability to exploit the Cuban people and to exploit the resources of the island. While they are happy and pleased about this, I will say, we should recommit ourselves to the defense of the Cuban Revolution, and this involves the struggle for the transformation of society, for an ending to the capitalist system, not only in Cuba, but around the world.